Hi, everyone. Welcome to the QRTP bench card training. We'll go ahead and get started in just a moment. And thank you for joining us today. I am Megan Kearsley. I am the court improvement program coordinator at the State Court Administrator's Office. A little bit of a mouthful. And want to thank you all for being here today for the QRTP bench card training. This presentation is being delivered in partnership with the Court Improvement Program and other stakeholders involved in the Family First implementation team. This is one of many, I think this is the 6th training that has happened on the QRTP bench card, and will be one of many trainings that are offered to the various stakeholder groups between now and the end of the year or beyond. You were sent the QRTP bench card this morning. It is the only handout for this training. Really, it's the tool that we are referencing throughout this presentation, and the PowerPoint directly refers to the text on the bench card. Audio and video for all attendees has been disabled. However, if you would like to raise your hand to ask a question, please do so, and we will unmute you from our end to ask your question. Otherwise, we encourage you to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and Ashley will be taking breaks throughout the presentation to answer any questions that come up. Please note that this training is being recorded and will be available online for future viewing. We will also ensure that Jenny Bender gets a copy of this so she can have access to this or provide access to all of you. Finally, if we're getting close to the end of our scheduled webinar, Ashley will continue past 1 p.m. to finish the content. However, feel free to jump off should you have another obligation at 1 p.m. But we are confident we can get this in within the hour, and it looks like Ashley is ready to go, so I'll turn it to her.
Thank you so much, Megan. And for those that haven't met me, my name is Ashley Chase. I am a staff attorney and the legislative liaison at the Office of the Child's Representative. But more importantly, for the purposes of today's training, I am the co-chair of Colorado's implementation team for Families First Prevention Services Act. So I've been in that role for about 2 years now and involved in the creation of this bench card, as well as some of the other groups. So happy to join you today. We had a last minute change. So I'm sure many of you know Josefina. She originally was going to help present this with me today and ensure that we had somebody with that CASA background who can answer questions, and she had a last minute family obligation. So I'm going to do my best to do both. And we'll just ask for a little grace that if there are a few questions I can't answer, we'll make sure to circle back at the end to get those answered for you. As Megan mentioned, I am going to stop. So the way the slideshow is set up, there's one topic per slide. So at the end of the slide, I will stop for questions on that slide, and then we can keep going throughout. I know in this virtual setting, sometimes it's a little awkward to know when you should jump in or not. So rest assured, we'll stop at the end of each slide and make sure we answer questions as we go. And then I also want to just preface before we dig into this, we don't know what we don't know. So I am very involved in this work in Colorado, and I think if there are answers, I know most of them in regards to this particular bench card and the work around it, but there are and continue to be questions around Families First that we just don't have an answer to yet as a state. So I just like to tell people that ahead of time, because I think it can be a little frustrating sometimes in trainings in this area where you feel like there's more questions than answers. And I will tell you that sometimes there are going to be questions where there is no answer yet. It's still an unanswered question. But every time we do this, we have more information. We're able to answer more questions, and then we'll do a good job of circling back if we need to. So just to start us out, I'm going to review the QRTP Basics, because I don't know how long it's been since you've had a training on Families First. But if you'll remember, QRTP is the Qualified Residential Treatment Program. That's what the acronym stands for. And it is a new requirement under Families First. So if you remember, Families First is about funding. So 4E supported placements, so what you can pull down from the federal government as far as funding goes for placements of children, will change after implementation of Families First. So With that change, the supportive placements will be if you're home with family, if you are placed with kin, if you're in a family-like foster home, or if you need a higher level of care, if you're in a QRTP. What that means is that after Families First is implemented, you will not be able to get 4E funding for placements such as RCCF level of care or residential treatment level of care, unless they've become a QRTP, or group homes, with some very limited exceptions for certain populations. So that will be kind of a big switch that we've been planning for here in Colorado. And in order for one of these RCCF or residential treatment centers that we work with now to be able to become a QRTP, these are the basics that the federal act requires. And the idea behind this is to ensure that these youth are in high quality, trauma-informed therapeutic placements that really are for short, focused treatment reasons, and not just a place where kids end up for long periods of time, because we know that they have very poor outcomes if they're housed in these higher level of congregate care settings. So for a placement to be a QRTP, they have to be licensed and accredited. So currently in Colorado, all of our foster care placements, including our CCF, have to be licensed. So that is not new. They're licensed through the State Department or through a child placement agency. What is different is that accreditation. So the accreditation can only happen through a few agencies nationwide, and it is an expensive process. So we do have several facilities in Colorado that are already accredited. If you think of some of the really big facilities that come to mind are probably accredited. So if you think of like your Third Way type of placement or something like that, those are typically accredited. For some of the smaller ones that aren't accredited, that is a bit of a barrier to becoming a QRTP, because there are wait lists. If there's only so many entities that can issue this accreditation, QRTP is going to be, nationwide. You can see how there'd be a little bit of maybe a backlog there. And so I think that some people are working on how to address that, and it can be expensive. And so I think that there's been some work in the state trying to figure out how they can help facilities kind of overcome some of those hurdles. The important piece is kind of the buzzword in the last few years, but it has to have trauma-informed care. So the state has actually developed a trauma-informed care model. It's outlined in rule. It came from our Office of Behavioral Health, had a lot of vetting. So there's actually a model that they'll have to follow, and then they'll be held accountable to ensuring that the care that they provide is that trauma-informed level at that well-defined kind of category. It requires an independent assessment. So this means that somebody outside of the Department of Human Services and outside of the placement facility has to do this independent assessment based on a validated tool to say, does this kid belong in this level of care or not? And that's a big change, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today in the bench card, because that is something that you as CASA will be involved in and aware of as it interplays with the court system. One of the exciting things I think about the QRTP requirements is it very intentionally includes family and siblings in treatment, but also in contact and making sure they continue to be part of the youth's life, which again, I know is important to a lot of you acting as CASA, since you often are interacting with the whole family and not just the youth that happens to be in care. Obviously, there is a court approval process involved here. So again, everything about this QRTP and this placement is going to be very intentional. You're going to have court oversight. You're going to be involved. It's going to happen in a little different way. And then one of the other really exciting parts about this is that it's going to have that aftercare support. So it requires, under the federal law, 6 months of aftercare services when that youth leaves the QRTP placement to a lower level of care, whether that's going home, going to a foster home, going with family and kin. It could be any of that. So that's kind of a very quick rundown of just the basics of QRTP. Did we have any questions about that piece before we get into the bench card? All right, I'm thinking we don't. Then I will move on. So the bench card looks like this. You should have gotten this in your email earlier today. And this is the same bench card that judicial officers are going to be using as a reference, that guardian ad litems, respondent parent counsel, county attorneys, everybody's going to be kind of using this same sort of reference card during these hearings, which I think is really going to help all of us have a, consistent in communication and language and understanding around this kind of new process and concept. And because we want you to feel confident in this, I just want to talk to you a little bit about where the bench card came from so you can see some of the work that went into it. So like I said, the Families First implementation team has been in kind of working on all issues related to implementation in Colorado for about 2 years. And that implementation team has a set of work groups. One of the work groups is a QRTP work group, because there were a lot of things that were going to have to be figured out about this QRTP process. And that work group had a very small legal team that formed to come up with the language of the bench card. So the very small legal team consisted of a guardian ad litem, RPC, a judge, a county attorney, a staff from human services, and a few other people. And they came up with the language by looking at what the implementation team has said they want to see happen, what the federal law says, what some of the Colorado statutes say. And so in looking at all that, came up with the language for this. That language then went back to the QRTP subgroup, which has a pretty broad stakeholder group working on it. So lots of different types of providers and people involved in the system vetting it. From that group, once it was approved, it went back up to the implementation team group, which again has really wide stakeholdering and a lot of good different perspectives involved. And, each step of the way, people made corrections, asked questions, made changes. The task force looked at this, the Senate Bill 254 task force. So it really went through several layers of committees, stakeholders, lots of different eyes on it. And this ended up being our not project. What's the final thing? It's the thing. You know what I mean? The final bench card, the final language. So we're going to walk through this document just section by section and, explain what each section is and does. And I think by the end, hopefully you'll get a really good understanding of how this is going to play out in court and how this QRTP thing might work in real life. Fingers crossed. Any questions about the background on this before we go into our first section?
We've got no questions at this point, Ashley.
All right, we're looking good. Now we're going to cruise into the meat of the day. So one of the first sections is going to be this blue box that pops up, which is the timeline. So there's a lot of different timelines involved in QRTP that is a little different than what we're used to in our cases currently. And so one thing I really want to point out to everybody is that when you're thinking about these timelines, they are triggered by the date of placement. So best practices is going to be that this whole assessment process we're going to talk about is going to happen prior to a youth being placed in QRTP. And, if they're not placed yet, these timeframes, they aren't triggered. So ideally, you're going to be doing this independent assessment and things like that before the youth is ever placed. So you really know whether they belong in QRTP or not. But we all know there are going to be situations where that's just not feasible and the youth is going to be placed, and then that will trigger all of these timeframes. So date of placement. So physically when the child first gets there is the date that you're going to start counting all of these types of things. So the first, kind of time frame to think about is, we have to, well, I should back up. You can put a child, youth, or juvenile under Families First in any placement for up to 14 days and still pull down that federal funding, that 4E funding. So you could be placed in a QRTP for up to 14 days without triggering this process. So that's just something to know as you think about respite, or you might hear things from departments about, oh, we have 14 days. That's where that comes from. But again, that doesn't change this time frame for when the court has to review. That time frame is triggered not 14 days after the youth is placed, but on the day the youth is placed. So from the day the youth is placed, the court has 60 days to review and approve the placement decision. However, in Colorado, we made one caveat to that. So that's the federal law. And in Colorado, we decided to, maybe go one step further in the idea of kind of protecting the youth and living up to the intent of the law. And that is that if the youth is already placed in a QRTP and the assessment says they don't actually belong in that level of care, then the court needs to have a hearing within 30 days of the placement. And so the whole premise here is that we don't want youth languishing in placements they don't belong. We don't want them in QRTP if it's not appropriate. And so we're going to shorten that time frame if that situation happens. The other way in which that time frame gets shortened from 60 days to 30 days would be if one of the parties objects to the placement. So if the youth the child, the parent, the county, somebody objects to that placement, that time frame would be shortened. This would be a really good area in which I think a CASA might collaborate with either the county attorney or the guardian ad litem, or potentially even the respondent parent counsel if the CASA has strong feelings about a placement or objects. I certainly think it would make a lot of sense to be speaking to one of the attorneys and parties to ensure that maybe somebody objects and you get in sooner rather than later. So if you go to court and the court does not approve the placement, the child then has to be moved within 30 days of the decision. So again, that means if the child is not moved within 30 days, that you can no longer pull down those federal funds. So I mean, technically, I guess you could let a youth stay there longer than 30 days, but the idea is if they don't belong there, you get them out. So they need to be out within 30 days. You cannot pull down federal dollars after 30 days if the court is not approving the placement. When the youth is in that placement, you're going to be reviewing that placement at least every 90 days. So this is going to happen in conjunction with hearings that are already set. And we'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the review section. The other kind of interesting timeframes to be aware of here is that Families First is going to implement these lifetime limits on youth being in care. So there are two different timelines for that. If you have a youth who's under the age of 13, 13 is kind of the magic number here. If they're under the age of 13, then they cannot be in a QRTP placement for more than 6 months. And that means either consecutive or non-consecutive. And if they do need to be in longer than that 6 months, it requires approval by the director of the State Department of Human Services. So there is going to be a process in which you can seek that director approval, but those timelines are really important. And I think it'll be really important for everyone, including CASA involved, to be thinking about those timelines. You know, I know a lot of times CASA is going to have the history with the child that maybe the state, you know, the caseworker doesn't. And so reminding the professionals, hey, this kid's been in QRTP before, we're getting close to that 6-month mark, I think would be really helpful in ensuring we meet these requirements. If that child is 13 or over, then they can be in QRTP for up to 12 months consecutively or up to 18 months non-consecutively. So those are sort of the lifetime limits there. And again, you can go beyond that, but it requires that high level approval by the director of the State Department. And then of course, we already talked about it, but you'll hear me speak about it a few more times. There is a requirement of 6 months of aftercare services, which is a really exciting part of the law. And that's kind of just the basic overview of the timelines. We'll get in more specifically to the assessments and the review and some of the things in here, but I think this is just a good overview of those timeframes triggered. Any questions about the timeframes?
Ashley, we don't have any written questions, but we did have somebody raise their hand right at the end of your last pause. So Ruth Ann, I'm going to unmute you at this point to ask your question.
I did not receive the handout that you are referring to. And I wondered if someone could send that to me sooner rather than later. It will make it easier for me to understand the presentation.
Certainly. If you could put your email address into the Q&A, I will pull it from there and make sure it gets to you. Thanks, Ruth Ann.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ruth Ann. We'll make sure you get that. Thank you, Megan. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit first about sort of that initial QRTP placement. So when I'm saying initial, I mean this time. So if a youth has been in before, but then went home, let's say, and is coming back, like initial means, you know, when they are reentering for this time. If they're in QRTP and they're going from one QRTP to another, that doesn't really trigger this initial kind of hearing or these initial considerations. But anytime they're starting again, we would want to think about this. So this box on the bench card is kind of just for you to be thinking of if a youth's going into QRTP and you're getting ready for that initial hearing, here's some of the things you might want to be thinking about. Because, you know, I think that if you're thinking these through, you might really prevent some red flags or be able to do some work ahead of time to make this a little clearer. When it comes to, I'm thinking with CASA, as you're preparing maybe a court report for that initial hearing, some of these questions may help you craft that report. You might be thinking about some of these things as you're writing that report or putting it together. So I think it's just good, helpful questions for all of us to ask as we're preparing for that initial placement. So the first one would be, what is that placement date? You're going to want to make sure everyone's working on the same time frame, has the same date, understands what that is. What is the age of the child? Because of course, that really impacts timeframes. And have they been in QRTP placement before? If so, how long? Because I think it's really important when we go into this, we know how much time we have. We're not putting ourselves into difficult situations by not giving the proper approvals and things like that. So this is something I think CASA will really be helpful with. I know I train the guardian ad litems that they really need to be thinking about this, but everyone in the courtroom needs to be asking these types of questions. We'll get into the details of the assessment, but before that initial hearing, it's really important that the assessment was completed, that it was done by a qualified individual, and that it was done either prior to placement or no later than 30 days after placement. You want to make sure that that's been filed with the court. You want to make sure CASA has been able to see it along with everybody else. And part of that assessment requires a family and permanency team. And again, we're going to talk about the assessment more in depth here in the next slide. So has that happened? Did they assemble? If you have a youth who's 14 and over, they get to include team members. What did that happen? Were the meetings held at a time and a place convenient for the family? So one of those things about Families First that I really love is that it requires that these types of meetings really be family focused. So they're held at a time and place convenient for the family. And so I think that those are all going to be considerations that will be important for us to understand as we head into the initial hearing and make sure it happens. Obviously, for guardian ad litems as well as CASA, I think really ensuring the youth was able to select team members becomes really important. So for your youth that are 14 and over, that'll be something you really want to make sure happened for them. So those are just some of the considerations. Did we have a question pop up on that one?
No questions yet.
Woohoo! Look at me.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we'll talk about the independent assessment, because obviously if you're going to that initial hearing, the independent assessment is like vital to that consideration. It is a big part of what you're going to be talking about, thinking about, litigating, all of that kind of stuff. So as I mentioned, the independent assessment is done by a neutral third party. It's called a qualified individual. The qualified individual has been defined in statute, and they are going to administer a tool. So the tool was required under federal law. In Colorado, we chose a tool called the CANS. I don't remember what all those letters stand for, but this tool is pretty well respected. It's a validated tool. It works off of an algorithm is being fine-tuned to work in Colorado. There were lots of reasons the CANS was chosen. And I can also tell you there are some other states around us in our region that are also using the CANS. So I think it gives us a really interesting opportunity to kind of compare data in an apples to apples way that we maybe haven't seen before. So CANS is the tool. The qualified assessor will administer the tool as they're doing this assessment. So the qualified assessor was defined in, and I should have mentioned this before when we talked about those timelines, a lot of these things from the bench card have already been in statute and inserted into our laws here in Colorado. So the bill last year that did that was Senate Bill 20-162. A lot of the information has been added to 19.1.115. This particular definition is in 19.1.103. It's 87.7. So you can find these throughout the children's code, which is helpful. So you don't have, but obviously on the bench card, we try to give you some information about that too. Here's the definition pulled from the children's code for the qualified individual. And I just point this out because I think some things are really important. So they cannot be an interested party. So, oops, did I just make it go away? See, I get all button happy. They cannot be an interested party or a participant in the court proceeding. They can't have any personal or business relationship, which means they cannot work for the placement. They cannot work for the county. I mean, this person has to be independent and really making these, making this evaluation something that's really credible and really something that we can all rely on. So it can't be like the guardian ad litem or the CASA or anybody else involved, right? This is a totally different entity coming in and doing this. So in Colorado, what we have worked out is that the independent assessors are going to be managed through ASOs, which is, it's almost ridiculous how I forget what this stands for. It's a something service organization. Last time I forgot the O, Megan. This time I forgot the A.
Administrative Service Organization.
I forget this I've done this training so many times and I have like a mental block against ASOs. So ASOs are something that are currently in our system set up, and they do other assessments for things like the Child Mental Health Treatment Act. So it really was a process and a framework that existed that we could use to make this work really seamlessly. So the ASOs will be doing the assessments. That's managed through OBH, the Office of Behavioral Health. And those of you who are real acronym pros might realize that OBH is actually under the State Department of Human Services, which makes you their question, is that really independent from the county departments of human services? I can assure you that it is. That is something we had to have vetted through the federal partners. But because of how some other programs OBH manages and how those have their independence, ASOs being one of them, it sort of passed the smell test. So these ASOs are going to be the qualified individuals who will administer this tool and do this process and do these assessments for the court. Whoops, got a little trigger happy there again. So we talked a little bit about this assessment, but here is more in detail what is required of the assessment. Some of these things I already mentioned, but what you'd want to do going into that initial hearing is make sure these things happened in the way in which they're supposed to. So, you know, are they considering the child, family, and youth placement preferences? Was the child interviewed? That's not a requirement, but I think it's important for us to know. Did they work with the family and permanency team? That is required. We talked about if the youth's over 14, they have to be able to have somebody they chose. So here's kind of all of those different questions and things that we're going to be thinking about and assessing with that assessment when we go to court for that initial hearing. And it looks like we do have some questions for this one, maybe.
We do. We have a question from Stacy. She asks, for kids who can't go home after leaving residential, will foster parents be given more direct training on trauma and how they can truly support some of the challenges that come with that for kids, hoping to minimize placement changes?
Such a great question. So yes, when the youth discharges from QRTP and cannot go home but goes to a foster home, they will get the 6 months of aftercare services then in the foster home. So instead of just coming there and not having much, they're going to have that whole 6 month of services. The other interesting thing about Families First, you know, the focus of Families First when we're not talking about this placement side is on prevention services. And one of the, I think, cool things about it is that they view prevention not just as the child and their biological family anymore, but as any caregiver. So now you can pull down money to provide prevention services to kinship providers, to foster homes, to other people, with that idea, just as you identified that you want to mitigate, you know, changes in placements and things like that. So there will be quite a few more services that you can pull down funding for. So I think that we'll see those being more and more available for our foster homes as well as kinship homes. And then again, biological homes as well. Okay. So you have the assessment. The next thing you do is you're going to court. So we'll just talk a little bit about what the court findings have to be to kind of help frame the conversation of what this looks like. And on your bench card, these findings are in a few different places. So on the front, it's just kind of the really basic findings for QRTP. This is set out by the federal language, and then we codified it in 191115. So it's some of the same buzzwords that we use now. Is it the most effective and appropriate level of care, least restrictive environment, consistent with the permanency plan? That third part's a little new. We don't talk about that, but I think that's an important addition. On the back side of your bench card, though, we have sort of a chart of findings, because of course, this isn't just a yes, no answer. It becomes very complicated when you have this independent assessor providing this information, but then the court ultimately has to approve or not approve this level of placement. So the way this form works is that you have this column where the court is approving and ordering QRTP, and you live in this column when the court is not approving or ordering QRTP. Here, let me get that division of use services stuff out of there because we're going to talk about that next. Then if you look at the rows, this is where the assessor recommends QRTP, and this is where the assessor does not recommend QRTP. So if you live in this box, the court and the assessor agree, easy, everyone's happy, we go forward, no problem. But if you live in this box, it's like the assessment says yes, but the court says no for some reason. And so you'll see that the findings are a little different in those two places. One of the big differences I'll highlight here for you is that because this assessor is independent and it's such a fundamental part of QRTP and why the process works, we really want to make sure courts are giving that assessment great weight. So if that assessment is done the way it's supposed to be, it really should carry a lot of weight. And we don't want GALs, CASAs, courts, trying to overcome those assessments. Unless there really is kind of a problem with the way in which it was done, or there's really solid information about why something should happen differently for this family. Because of course we all know you have to be individualized. Like none of us are creative enough to come up with the stuff we see in these cases. So of course you need to have some flexibility. But generally speaking, that assessment, hopefully will be accurate and we will abide by it unless there's some other problem. If the court is going to deviate from the recommendation, so recommendation says yes, court says no. If you're deviating like that, the court actually has to make specific findings about why. So, I think that'll be good for everyone to kind of understand where it went wrong and why the court's doing something different. I think that will help inform practice and make sure, if there are problems with the assessment, those are highlighted and identified and can be fixed and that kind of thing. The findings, there's 4 of them, are in 19.1, 115. They're pretty basic, like, was the protocol followed? Because obviously if the assessor didn't follow the protocol, that might be a really good reason in which you wouldn't agree or you would deviate from the recommendations. Strengths and specific needs of the family. So that's where I said sometimes you really need to be able to individualize things for a certain family. The expected length of stay and the placement preference of the child, youth, or family. So being able to take that preference into play. I point out those findings because while they're required by the court, again, I think as CASA, as well as other people involved in the system, if you are struggling with the recommendation, then these are the types of things you might want to focus in on as to why, if you're trying to help explain to the court about what you want to see happen in the case or what your concerns are, that might be a good, those factors may help you think that through. Whoops. Questions on findings?
Yes, we've got one. Will multiple assessments be completed throughout the life of a case?
Oh, great question. So, yeah, no, but yes. How do you like that answer? So this independent assessor process through the ASOs and OBH is only going to happen when the youth enters care. So no, you're not going to have a bunch of assessments happening for the same youth unless they go home and then they have to come back into care. However, I will tell you from being on the implementation team and the QRTP subgroup, there are many facilities who plan to continue to use the CANS tool, and they're training their staff to administer it so that they can continue to use that tool to kind of gauge the progress of a youth. And, it might help them determine when step down would be appropriate or what treatment is appropriate and that kind of thing. So in that way, you may see these assessments done or a part of the assessment done throughout the stay, but that's kind of going to be specific to where they're placed. I will also say, I think there are some other entities that are thinking about using CANS type of tools so that we can see more consistency across the state. So you may see the CANS administered in different areas, but the true initial assessor process, no, is only going to happen at that initial part of the case. All right. So we're going to take a little sidestep here and talk about juvenile delinquency. And I know that as CASA, only I think 3 or a handful of your programs actually assign CASAs to juvenile delinquency cases. But I know that a lot of you who have youth in your dependency and neglect cases often have youth that cross over and have both. So I thought it was still important to talk a little bit about how juvenile delinquency and QRTP interplay a little bit. I will tell you, if you are in one of those programs in which you do a lot of this juvenile delinquency work, we did do this training for the juvenile delinquency population, and we may have touched on a few additional things that I'm not going to be able to cover today. And so you might want to go back and look at that video if that's helpful to you. So families first, and therefore QRTP does apply to our juvenile justice population. And in fact, because it's so complicated in Colorado, the way in which our state is set up is different than a lot of other states. We actually started a work group a little bit later in the implementation process, but it's been going for quite a while now. So we have a juvenile justice work group working on some of these specific issues on how this is going to impact our delinquency youth. Because while some of it will be very similar, there are some very unique circumstances for our youth that are in the delinquency system that we just need to be aware of and be planning for. So this assessment we've been talking about will be done for youth being placed in a QRTP or when stepping down from a QRTP for our delinquent youth if we're talking about that placement happening pre-adjudication and not part of sentencing. So we'll get to sentencing in a few minutes, but when you're talking about youth that are pre-adjudication, being held in detention or in this, system, and they maybe qualify for this QRTB level of care, they will still be doing the assessment and seeing if that's appropriate or not. Now, I do have to point out that the CANS tool and assessment is only one of several assessments happening for our youth and delinquency court. So those of you that are working in delinquency might be familiar with or hear about, there's a slew of juvenile justice reform bills that have gone through in the last few years. Those reform bills require much more updated assessments. There are people working on different assessments. You might have heard of things called the SASE, and I can't even remember what some of the other ones are, but there are other assessments happening in this delinquency population. That is something that has been taken into consideration. We have people on the Juvenile Justice Work Group and the Juvenile Justice Reform Committee that are crossing over membership to ensure that these things are going to be able to play well together, for lack of a better word. So this is just one of those assessments for our juvenile justice groups. This initial hearing we talked about happening, you may have noticed there's a little asterisk up here when we talked about it before. That asterisk is because of this language here. And I bring it up in our delinquency population because that's where it's going to come up the most. So these initial hearings will be happening in court in our cases, in these dependency and neglect cases. And if a youth is in court, currently has jurisdiction on a delinquency matter, it will be heard in court. However, we do have youth that are post-adjudication, maybe on probation or something of that nature, where the court no longer is reviewing the case and doesn't have jurisdiction. Or you may have a youth who's actually placed and sentenced to the Department of Youth Services and the court no longer has jurisdiction. And those youth may also qualify for QRTP in certain instances. And so we needed a mechanism for there to be approval and this initial hearing done for youth that weren't in front of a court. So for those few youth that are not in front of a court, the Administrative Review Division, which you often hear referred to as ARD, is able to do this process. And they are working out the way in which that will happen right now. There's meetings, I think Megan was at a meeting this week talking about that. But I really want to stress, particularly for those of you listening here, since most of you do DNN work, the idea is that if a kid's in court, we want the court to do this. We only want ARD doing this if we really don't have another choice. After your initial hearing, you can do the review hearings, which we'll talk about in the next slide, through ARD if nobody objects. So I know that there are some of our rural jurisdictions that do things through ARD more frequently because they maybe don't have court on a regular basis or something of that nature. So it is possible to do ARD reviews of these placements if everyone consents. But again, the general consensus, I think, of most people in the work groups and on the implementation team was that if a kid is needing this level of care, we really would like to have the court, oversight and involvement because those are some really tricky cases to be navigating. So, as I said, this applies to our youth in delinquency. However, when it comes to, and I probably shouldn't put this up yet, I'm distracting you guys. When it comes to our youth that are sentenced, if a youth has to be sentenced to detention or youth services, the QRTP is not going to override that, right? That's about community safety. That's statutorily prescribed. That's the judicial discretion. I mean, this QRTP Families First process isn't going to negate all those sentencing options and things like that. Like commitment is not placement. So there are other rules and statutes into play when it comes to commitment. So if you have a CANS that says this youth doesn't qualify for QRTP, but a youth is getting committed, like they're going to be in the committed placement. It doesn't, the CANS isn't going to overrule that. So again, just for perspective, if you have a youth that's not being committed, that hasn't been adjudicated yet, but maybe needs a QRTP, yes, you're going to use that CANS assessment. And DYS may use it as well. If they have a youth who's been committed to a high level of care and they're progressing through that program and it looks like they qualify for a step down, they will probably use the CANS tool to decide if they should go to that QRTP. But I just want to make sure that that line is clear, that this isn't going to trump sentencing decisions or DYS's authority to place youth in whatever commitment facility they need to use. So I just want people to kind of understand how that works. And then one of the other interesting things the federal law provided is that when you implement Families First in your state, what they didn't want to have happen as sort of an unintended consequence is youth, instead of going through the dependency neglect system, being shifted into the delinquency system to like avoid things like QRTP or whatnot. Because in some states, it's not as clear that it would apply to both youth because the way in which the delinquency system or the Department of Youth Services is run. In Colorado, it's pretty clear. So there's a report that we'd be doing like 2026 or something like that, which feels really far away now, but I am forecasting that I'm going to be training in 2026 saying, wow, that felt like it happened in a hurry. In any case, we need to start now with tracking this, because otherwise, how are we going to know if we're shifting kids into that system inappropriately? So one of the ways in which this is going to happen is that with that Senate bill I talked about passing last year, they added to statute this requirement, which is that when you're committing a juvenile to youth services, that the court has to make a specific determination about whether lack of available and appropriate congregate care placements was a contributing factor in committing the youth. And then the idea is that the answer should be no. And if we're getting a lot of yeses, we have a flag that something's going wrong in the system and we need to get in there and figure it out prior to this reporting requirements and things like that. So it'll kind of give us a leg up at making sure that's not happening. All right, questions on the juvenile delinquency side? Perfect.
No questions. I answered one asking for a resource on where to find the link to a training and put that in the chat or in the Q&A.
Oh, thank you so much, Megan. All right, so we've already talked about this commitment to youth services, so let's get rid of that box. And we're going to talk about the discharge here in a little bit, so we'll get rid of that box. So we're just going to talk about the reviews for a minute here. So now our youth is in QRTP, we've had our court hearing, we've had whatever fights have to happen, like they're in QRTP and they are getting the services. So when they're in that level of care, I mentioned this one, it maybe on the time frame slide, I think you have to review these at least every 90 days. So these absolutely should be combined with hearings that you are already having. So in a lot of our courts, we now review cases pretty regularly. You have a permanency plan hearing or a review hearing, typically every 90 days. It can go, up to 6 months. But if you have that youth in QRTP, you can't go up to 6 months any longer. This has to be reviewed at least every 90 days. If you're coming back to court more frequently because you're on a dancer docket, or that's just the practice in your courtroom, or something's happening so the judge brings you back in 30 or 60 days, you should go ahead and review the QRTP placement every time you're in court. It just has to happen at least every 90 days. That's an actual federal requirement. And we also put it in our law as well, again, in that 19-1-115 statute. So it was interesting because the federal law required the Department of Human Services to report kind of a slew of things to the court. And that's what these bullet points here are kind of based on. This is based on the language in the federal law of what the department had to report to the court. The federal law was the sort of silent on the issue of that the court had to do anything with it, which was really odd. So our groups, when we put the bench card together, we're like, I'm pretty sure if the feds thought it was important enough for the department to report this, the court should be considering it. So that's why these are all these bullets are here in the reviews, just to say all of us in court. So I think these are, again, really good things for CASAs to be looking at as they're thinking about what they want to put into their court report for review, or what to be thinking about and considering, in between those reviews, if you have a youth in this QRTP setting. And a lot of these, are things that we do anyway and make sense. But these are the things that the court is going to be looking at and reviewing for that youth in QRTP. So this discharge planning, if you're going to have that 6 months of aftercare services, you really need to start planning for that at the beginning. And so I want to point that out to everybody, because I can see CASA having a really important role in asking those questions, being at those meetings, talking about what that looks like. These are some of the findings, like consistency with the short and long-term goals, that, there's ongoing assessment of their strengths and needs. I think, again, that's where the facilities are thinking maybe they'll be using that CANS assessment more frequently, but there are other ways in which you can assess that. So these are all the different things. There's a lot of, I think, push here to make sure that treatments and services are really meeting the needs of the youth. So when the youth comes in on day one, a lot of times we don't know all the things that's going on with that youth. So, if we find out more information 4 weeks later, that's actually being intentionally put into the treatment plan, thinking about how that's going to affect things, being really thoughtful about the way in which we're doing that. This one I love: specific efforts about what they're doing to prepare the child, youth, and juvenile to return home or to a relative. Now, that's the goal always. And of course, a family foster home could also be an option here. So what are the efforts made to really make sure that can happen? So that means efforts made for the juvenile. That also means efforts made for the families. One of the things I think that's really interesting about the way in which Families First will work is that I think, we always a lot of times concentrated on what mom and dad are doing in their treatment plan, what the child is doing in treatment, and then those had to match up at the perfect time. But what I think Families First allows us to do a little better is that, if the child is making slow progress, and like parents making no progress, but aunt is making really good progress, and maybe she wasn't able to meet the child's needs before, but now she's gotten all kinds of help or whatever, and she is much more capable now. Maybe the youth isn't making great progress, but they're able to step down because the aunt can now meet the needs with some prevention services and in-home placements. So I think it kind of allows you to look at the big picture in a little different way than we have before. And again, this is a place where I told guardian ad litems, I think they're well suited to helping think about these things. And CASA, I think you also are going to be really well suited to be thinking about kind of the whole picture and how the pieces fit and when you can get the child to move earlier, hopefully, rather than later. Another thing that's really exciting is the intentional way in which I said before, they are facilitating family and sibling participation and contact. So it's both. You're participating in treatment, you're being integrated into treatment, but you also have contact. And so this is something I think we all need to be really cognizant of. These are, again, in the bench card, which doesn't make them law. Just, this is what practitioners are going to use in court. But we did also put some of these requirements here into, like I said, 19-1-115. So I just put this here to highlight that for you, that it's going to be there. This is detailing the evidence required at the hearings. And then, of course, I erased it before, but we'll bring it back now. When the youth is getting ready to discharge, there has to be documentation of a family-based aftercare plan, minimum of 6 months. And it doesn't mean only if they go to parent. It's this aftercare plan wherever they go, 6 months, which is a nice long chunk of time to be able to plan for this. The way in which this is going to be delivered is a little bit of a question. So it looks like there's going to be sort of a hodgepodge of ways in which this happens. So certainly there are times, so the facility itself has to plan for this requirement. So they'll be doing some of that. We all know that, of course, a lot of our placements are not, especially QRTP placements, are not in the community the child and youth live in. I do think this last year has probably given us a little more faith that we can do some of those things remotely. The facilities themselves are talking about partnerships in which they can help each other deliver these services. That's really exciting. The other piece that's been interesting is that HCPF, which is Healthcare Policy and Financing, has been at the table this whole time. So that's the group that runs Medicaid and some of like your regional centers, your RAIs, or your community centered therapy places. That was a terrible phrase, but I think you guys know what I'm saying. They're all working together in a way too to see, if it's a Medicaid eligible youth, that perhaps Medicaid could provide some of that aftercare funding. So it looks like you're going to have, you know, kind of a variety of ways in which this is provided to youth, depending on where they are and what their needs are. And those conversations are continuing to happen to see how those puzzle pieces are going to fit together. And this is our last slide before Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and go forward to the Q&A and ask if we have any other questions. I'm going to look at my time here. Uh-oh. Oh yeah, look at that. 10 minutes to spare for questions if we need it. Did we have any last questions or anything anybody wanted to add?
I'm not seeing any questions come up in our Q&A, but feel free to raise your hand to be unmuted to ask a question at this point.
And I know I spoke quickly, so hopefully I didn't lose people. Well, I've put my contact information here. I am always happy to answer questions. I do know that Jenny Bender is involved in some of these groups and is available to you. And Josefina as well has been in some of these groups and working on it. So any of us are available to you all, and we're happy to answer questions at any time. You know, as we continue to hone in on this process and think about how it works, we'll continue to update trainings and offer trainings. Always happy to do that for CASA at any time. All right, and with that, I will be done and give you back like 9 minutes of your lunch break. And thank you all for your time and for coming to talk with us about this. I do think I think that we will have some, you know, bumps in the road as we first start, but I do really feel like this is going to end up with a system that's better for our kids and families. And so I'm excited about the changes and eager to get through the bumps and get to the good parts. Thank you all.